No, those are great questions, and everybody's been really cool today. Saint Benedict, what's up?
Hey Jay. So I am a Catholic, but I don't intend to have like a debate here because I'm quite sure I would lose. But I did have a few questions about some of the things that you
Yeah,
said
sure.
today. So I guess first of all, kind of going back to I think it was the first guy, but you had talked about the death penalty a little bit, um, and so
Yeah.
I was just kind of wanting to get your idea then. So do you not believe that? Um, Stances on moral issues can be somewhat like, do you not believe that the circumstances of the time can change necessarily like
The reason I don't think that works for the death penalty is that in traditional Roman Catholic moral theology, for example, if you look up the Catechism of Trent, the death penalty is seen as part of natural law and natural justice. And the problem is that can't change. You can't change that anymore in the Roman Catholic system than you could change, homosexuality being unnatural or against natural law, right? Those are but natural law in like Thomistic theology, for example, is a reflection of God's eternal law, God's eternal moral character. So it can never change. Um, Now, you could argue that there's inconsistencies in the Roman Catholic position on that. Like, for example, I would argue that if that's the case, and if polygamy is unnatural, then why would God permit something against his own eternal law in the Old Testament and then change it? So perhaps in the Roman Catholic system, there's actually precedence for natural law and eternal law changing. I just don't see how you could make sense of that if natural law is a reflection of God's character and essence, which is the eternal law.
okay, so would you argue then that there is a like set like list of crimes then that are deserving of the death penalty and that those can never change? um,
Well, even if there wasn't, I mean, I think you have in Roman Catholic theology the sins that cry out to God for vengeance in traditional Roman Catholic moral theology. But even if there wasn't that, the problem is that when Francis makes his arguments against it, he doesn't just say like it's no longer necessary. He says it's against the gospel, and I just don't see how that's not completely heretical and a denial of the last, I don't know, like 500 years of Roman Catholic theology. For example, one of the sainted popes of Trent, Pope Pius V, he has a document. I forget the name of it. It's a Latin name. I can pull it up for you. But I mean, he has a document saying that a priest engaged in sodomy is worthy. It should be put to death. How can priests who engage in sodomy be put to death at the time of the Council of Trent? And now we get to the point where gay unions can receive a blessing, gay couples can receive a blessing, and the death penalty is against the gospel.
right, yeah, I would agree with you on I guess I would agree with you on Francis's words being wrong there. Um, I don't see where that becomes a devastating argument against the papacy. The fact that a
Well, how
singular
can
pope,
natural law change? How can natural law change?
well, it definitely can't. Um,
Okay,
but
so but if Romans 13, which is usually what's cited, like in the Catechism of Trent, for example, about the death penalty, like if the principle of the death penalty is part of natural law and natural justice, it just doesn't seem how that's possible for it to change.
right, no, I agree with you that it definitely can't change. But I guess the point that I'm making is that Francis definitely said some things that were not necessarily well, first of all, everything that Francis said is not necessarily church teaching as far as like when
Yeah,
he says something that's not.
but that wouldn't matter, right? I agree, but it really wouldn't matter the status of the statement in terms of whether it's heretical or not, because when Pope Honorius is condemned, all he did was write a letter to another bishop about monothelitism, and that was enough to get him condemned. So, and I'm not trying to be like argumentative or butt into your argument, but I thought the same thing when I was a Roman Catholic, a Tradcat. But the problem is that, it, like, to become a heretic or to be a heretic, has nothing to do with the authority that you put behind the statement that you're making. For example, when Pope Leo excommunicated Martin Luther as a heretic, Martin Luther wasn't infallible, right? So infallibility is not a requirement to be a heretic. And if it was, then only the Pope could be a heretic, you see.
No, I agree with that. But I guess what I'm saying is that, and I'm not going to say that Pope Francis was a heretic, but what I'm going to say is that even if we were going to say that he was, I don't think that how do I put this? I I don't think that invalidates the office itself. I mean, it could definitely invalidate his pontificate
Well,
as his church teaching.
the problem with that position is that Vatican I seems to be very clear that the Roman See can never err, and you can't separate the living occupant of the see from the see itself, right? There's no such thing as like an ethereal Neoplatonic see of Peter that's not occupied by some living person. This is why it's called the living magisterium in the Roman Catholic tradition. So the living magisterium and the seat are pretty much identical, even though there is a distinction. Because yes, when a pope dies, everybody becomes a sedevacantis until there's a new pope elected. But the problem is that once a pope is elected by the Roman Curia and is accepted by the world, in Roman Catholic canon law, you can't doubt him. And the problem then becomes, well, Vatican I teaches that the Roman See is indefectible. So how is it indefectible if you have popes that can teach error and defect?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that I feel like there's a line here between necessarily like teaching, like where does teaching begin? I don't think that everything that the Pope says is necessarily like a teaching that is
Yeah, but
binding upon the faithful.
again, to be a heretic has nothing to do with the level of authority of your document, nor the attempt to bind people to it. Martin Luther, for example, he couldn't bind anybody to his ideas. He was a priest, monk, an Augustinian priest monk, and he just simply started arguing and debating and putting up his theses. He had no authority to bind anyone to it. He wasn't even a bishop. And yet, that has nothing to do with whether or not what he was obstinately publicly teaching was heresy or not. So again, even in the Roman Catholic system, if you look at your canon law, if you look at late sententiae and ipso facto condemnations, there are several sins in Roman Catholic theology which are called automatic ipso facto excommunications. Late sententiae means that it doesn't require the pronunciation of any synod, bishop, or council. It just means by the fact of the error itself. So, for example, one of those is abortion. In Roman Catholic theology, if you procure an abortion, you are, in canon law, automatically excommunicated from the church. You are no longer a member of the mystical body of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, they don't always follow that, but that's their canon law. Another heresy, interestingly, that does the same thing is apostasy, schism, and another sin that causes that is apostasy, heresy, and schism. Those are also classed like abortion as ipso facto late sententiae excommunications. And there's no restriction on who that applies to. In other words, it doesn't say, well, everybody except the bishop is late sent. No, it's anybody. So if let's say the local Novus Ordo bishop of Memphis, if he got up there and obstinately and publicly started saying, I no longer believe in the Trinity, and the Roman Catholic Church needs to change, and in my diocese of Memphis, we're not going to teach the Trinity anymore, right? And unless there was some sort of like, lapse of sanity or something that you could demonstrate, like if he continued to say that, he's automatically excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church. That's how their system is supposed to work in terms of their canon law. And it's the same with heresy, right? It doesn't really matter what your position is. And by the way, I would say except for the Pope, because in that Roman system, the Pope is never supposed to quote teach error. And even if he made a mistake in like a private theology book or something, like it depends on what the mistake is, right? Like he can't make a mistake on dogma, right? Because that would mean that he might be a heretic, right? So imagine Ratzinger writes a book and says, well, this isn't dogma and I'm not publicly teaching, but I don't believe in the Trinity. Well, that again is like a really like fuzzy gray area because it's like y to be a heretic, there's no requirement that you pronounce some sort of like public dogmatic authority behind the document. That's why, again, the Sixth Ecumenical Council and then three subsequent statements from the church after that council, they considered Honorius a heretic just for writing a letter to one bishop. That letter wasn't binding the whole church. It wasn't dogmatic. It was just a letter saying that he agreed with monothelitism.
Yeah, that's fair. I would definitely like to look back at that point and maybe talk to you about it again in the future. I wanted to talk or ask you about one other thing too. Um,
Sure.
so you said a couple times going back to the sacraments, especially like baptism, requiring matter, form, and intention. Um, and so you had said, you know, that like an atheist or a Muslim could baptize someone, and I guess my question would be, I guess like semantically yes, but is there ever a situation truly in which a Muslim or an atheist or someone, if you do not believe in God and you do not profess the faith, can you truly have the intention of baptizing someone?
Exactly. And I would say it just to me it makes no sense. I don't understand how that's possible.
Well,
But I mean that is the dogmatic position in Rome.
no, but I guess what I'm asking you then is like, is there like, I guess what situation and would there ever be a time, I guess I feel it, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't see when that would ever be a problem that would come up, is the point that I'm making, when a Muslim or an atheist would ever like attempt to baptize someone other than some sort of sacrilege of mocking the faith. um
Well, okay, so if you look in Denzinger when this first comes up, and I'm going from memory, it's around it could be 800s, not the numbering system of Denzinger, but like around 800 AD, maybe 1100, somewhere between 8 and 1100 AD. There's a statement in Denzinger where there's a question that arises over the necessity of baptism, and the response from the Roman See is the necessity of baptism is so strong that in cases in extremis, in Roman Catholic canon law, it's called in extremis, in extremity, in extreme cases, then even an atheist or a Muslim could be asked to baptize a person on the point of death, right? And there's a similar in extremis statements in Roman Catholic canon law when it comes to stuff like if I'm dying, can I request last rites from a Orthodox priest who's outside the Roman Catholic Church who's in schism? And the answer is yes. In extremis, if you had no access to a Roman Catholic priest, you could, in some cases, uh, request last rites from an Orthodox priest or a Coptic priest or something like that. So those are the cases or examples in the Roman Catholic dogmatic and canon law schemes where it comes up. They're not numerous, sure. I would grant that they don't happen a lot, but it really doesn't matter how often it happens because it's simply dogmatized to be the case that you can have, basically, from the Orthodox perspective, it's like saying you can have the faith outside the faith.
right, but I guess in those situations the intention would come from the person receiving the sacrament, not the person performing the sacrament. No.
No, 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 no. Matter, form, and intention means the celebrant of the sacrament, meaning the person doing it, whether the priest or the person in extremis. So no, it's literally saying that the atheist has to intend to do what the church does in the sacrament. Now, how an atheist can do that is beyond me. I have no idea, but that is the Roman Catholic position.
Right, right, but I guess I didn't phrase that right. I guess what I'm saying though is that like, if I was say requesting, if I was on my deathbed and I was asking, say, you to baptize me, I'm not calling you an atheist or a Muslim, but uh, just for the sake of the conversation, and I was asking you to baptize me.
Brother, I am atheist Muslim. 111 equal one. I am atheist Muslim. Brother, 111 equal one. How?
Yeah, that, you know, getting that impression out of Jay Dyer was not what I had on my list for today, but
I'm just sorry. Go ahead.
no, but anyway, I guess what I'm saying is like, if I have that intention to be baptized, and I'm just spitballing here, I'm trying to work through this, but if I have that intention, is it not possible that that intention can, I guess, work through you where you have the intention of baptizing me?
No, 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 no. Because remember, like in the Roman Catholic system, the one that's the celebrant of the sacrament, he's the one that is operating in persona Christi. So it means that the Muslim becomes, or the atheist is operating in the person of Christ, in persona Christi. Just like the in the Roman Catholic system, the priest offering the mass is operating in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, to offer the mass. Excuse me. So what it means in the Roman sacramentology is that the Muslim has to have the matter, being the water handy, the form. He has to say the words correctly, the magic words right, and if he doesn't say them perfectly, it's invalid. By the way, in fact, if you look at like I think it's quas primus. It even I'm going from memory, so again, I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure this is why, by the way, a lot of SSBX priests have extreme OCD. OCD. I'm not kidding. This is legit. In quas primus, it's even as extreme as like if a priest coughs or like pauses like during the words of consecration, it's a mortal sin. So it's like it's just kind of crazy the level of like legality that the traditional Tridentine level of system, put on this stuff. But no, it's that the Muslim or the atheist has to have the water, the exact words, and the intention to do what the church does. Not talking about you being baptized. The assumption is if you want to be baptized, well, obviously you have the intention. But no, the celebrant has to have it.
Right, but I would argue that because obviously the sacraments come from God, and are the avenue uh, by which God is able to receive us into His family and sanctify us. But so
Yeah, but this is misunderstanding what the faith is. The problem is that, again, as the Orthodox argues, the faith is not just this mechanical thing of like ritual transactions. The faith means that the one giving the sacrament has to also have the faith. Like, how can and when this comes up, the Orthodox response is usually something like, "How can one give what he doesn't have? Like, if he doesn't have the grace and the faith, he can't give it." And that's why it has to be an Orthodox priest who has the permission to celebrate, for example, the Eucharist. There's no such thing as celebrating the Eucharist without the permission to do so from an Orthodox bishop in the Orthodox ecclesiology. So what I'm saying is that the Roman system developed out of Augustus Ex Opere Alvarado the idea not just that anyone in schism is operating in the person of Christ, but even atheists and Muslims. And we would say that's not even possible because how can an atheist or a Muslim who has no part of Christ be in persona Christi? It doesn't even make sense because it's not a bare mechanical thing. And ultimately, the Roman Catholic system ends up in a bare mechanical thing. And that's exactly why it's really good to point to what that previous guy said. I don't know if you heard about the case in Arizona, but there was a Roman Catholic Novus Ordo priest a few years ago in Arizona who for like 30 years said the wrong form. He said the wrong words of baptism. And so if one of the three things is missing, then you don't have the sacrament. So matter, form, and intention. Well, he had the wrong form. He said the wrong words. So the Roman Catholic Church ruled that for 30 years, nobody had been baptized in that Arizona diocese. That is legalism. That is what appears to be a flexible, non-rigorous, non-donatist position in the Roman system actually ends up being extremely legalistic and absurd.
okay, so I guess that kind of where we're gonna disagree here um, is I guess that I would argue, and I know that you're gonna disagree with this, but is I guess that I would argue that um, that God in instituting the sacraments can work through even someone with a incorrect worldview or incorrect theology um, when
No, no,
when
but
he
it's
chooses
stronger
to.
than that. It's not just the schismatic or the heretical sect that believes in the Trinity or something. It's also people who have no faith. It's also an atheist. So I just no. How could an atheist even intend to do what the church does?
Okay, well then, can I ask this then? So you were,
Sure.
because you were, this kind of ties into something that you said earlier, because like with it going back to matter and form and everything, you talked about, uh, I don't know the exact wording here because I'm not Orthodox, but basically someone who had been baptized in another tradition, renouncing some sort of heresy, and then that causing, and then that like the basically the grace, like the baptism potentially being valid, but the
Yeah,
grace is not.
the impediment to grace is removed if he abjures the heresy.
Right. So in that case, would that person not be rebaptized? Then it's just upon the renouncing of that heresy, the graces are.
Well, that's what I was saying is that in the Orthodox tradition, in terms of the canons, the reason there's flexibility is that the canons outline different ways and different issues and cases on a case by case basis. So, for example, in the Sixth Ecumenical Council, there's canons that talk about not even recognizing at all a Unitarian baptism. So, even let's say a Unitarian group, let's say they said the right words, I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? The point of the canon is even though the words were said right, it doesn't matter because it was a Unitarian baptism, and that person has received no baptism. Likewise, in the Roman Catholic system, they do conditional baptisms just in case there wasn't any matter, form, and intention. So, ironically, the Roman Catholic system even has a similar perspective as the Orthodox on this position, which is why Roman Catholics all do conditional baptisms. And so it's very similar in the Orthodox Church where, let's say, a Coptic person, um, you know, had a Coptic baptism, which is the same as the Orthodox baptism in terms of the ritual itself. It's permissible in the flexibility of the canons for the church to say, you had a correct ritual, and so we don't have to do the ritual over. Therefore, we will receive you, say, by chrismation or by abjuration of heresy, etc. That's happened in the history of the Orthodox Church many, many times, and so even in the canons of Saint Basil, there's flexibility, right? That's what I was trying to get at. But like with the case in Arizona, in the Roman system, it's actually less flexible, is what I'm trying to illustrate, because by merely that priest saying, I think what happened, I'm going from memory, but I think what happened was he said something like, "We baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit," instead of "I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." And so Rome decreed that, basically that 20 or 30 years of baptisms were never done in that entire Arizona diocese, which is crazy because it's like, that's like extremely legalistic, right? Because he just got one little word wrong. But another case would be, for example, like let's say this has happened, by the way, a Novus Ordo priest baptizes people in the land, the sea, and the air. Okay, or I'm pretty sure every Orthodox bishop, even the most liberal, would be like, that's not even a baptism. So in that case, we would say you were never even baptized, right? So we're going to do baptism. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I guess um, I guess where I kind of get hung up is that if we're going to see we're going to say that baptism is largely reliant on in some sort of like internal disposition of the recipient of the sacrament.
No, no,
Or
no, 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 no. Let me be clear. That's actually a really good point. Let me be very clear because this is a great point. I'm not saying that.
okay,
So, for example, and this is actually a point that Augustine brings up against the Donatists. So, let's say that a canonical Orthodox priest is, let's say, everybody, as far as everyone can tell, he's Orthodox, right? But let's say he's a secret heretic, like he secretly thinks, ha ha ha, there's no Trinity,
right,
and no one knows, but I secretly believe this, right? That would be an instance of Donatism to say that because he's a secret heretic, all of his baptisms are invalid. Because conceivably, any priest might be a secret heretic, and we don't know their internal disposition.
right,
So we would agree that that would be Donatism, and so the key point here is that what makes a priest no longer a priest in the Orthodox Church is if he is excommunicated and defrocked and rejected by a synod, or he is extremely obstinate in his heresy. Even let's say a synod is like really lax on some heretical person and lets them go crazy for like 10 years. And the people underneath him are like, all right, look, obviously he doesn't even believe in the Trinity anymore. So we're not even going to go to his church anymore. Those people would be justified in that case in leaving the church, even though there's been no synodal decision. But generally speaking, the way it works in the Orthodox world is if you've not been excommunicated or removed by a synod or defrocked by a synod or a bishop, the assumption is the grace is there and the grace is present. Does that make so? That's why it's not donaticism. That's actually a really good question.
Right. I was actually referring to like an internal disposition of the recipient of the sacrament. So like when you're talking about like if there was some sort of heresy that they
Oh, I'm
needed to
sorry. I'm
renounce.
sorry.
Yeah, no, but thank you for that clarification. That was still good. Um, but I guess so. What I was saying was like if baptism requires some sort of internal disposition of the recipient, then is that not really kind of similar to the Protestant view of baptism, where it's like, uh, and I'm not saying that it's entirely the same,
No, no, no.
but
I think every Catholic catechism and you know, sort of normal catechesis would agree that a person who's going to be baptized has to have the internal disposition of repentance. Like you have to repent before being baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. Like
right,
you're going
but
to do confession
no,
before you go to baptism.
well, you wouldn't go to confession you before going to baptism, unless you were getting a
Well, what I
conditional
mean is
baptism.
like okay, well, like in my case, when I became Roman Catholic, I remember but you're correct, by the way. I don't mean to say that you would go do the official sacrament of confession. What I mean is that there is some kind of profession of, you know, I'm no longer Protestant, I now accept the Roman Catholic faith. I remember I was conditionally baptized. Um, I don't think Roman Catholics do like Orthodox do a lifetime confession. I don't recall, but I don't think they do because this was
We
I
do in
became
the
Roman.
case of a conditional baptism, but otherwise no.
Oh, you do?
Uh,
Well, my
yes.
understanding. So when I came in 2003, I remember um, my priest, Father Victor, was explaining that it's and maybe it's not this case anymore, or maybe he was wrong, but I remember him saying something like, it's pretty standard that we in the Roman Catholic Church do conditional baptism for any converts. Is that not the case? I don't recall.
So yeah, it really depends. I've seen it both ways. I think it kind of depends on the priest a lot of the times. So like if they're coming from like say a non-denominational church where we don't know the form or the matter that was
Exactly.
used.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
like
I think on the, by the way, I think, yeah, I understand. That's a fair point. And I think on this point, really the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic view on this point is not that different, really.
yeah, I would agree with that. Um, yeah, I guess just what I was kind of saying was, no, actually, something I wanted to touch on was you were saying that you would be required to do some sort of like profession of the faith before baptism. And while that is true to make the sacrament licit, the sacrament would still be valid even without that profession of faith. Um,
No,
like,
I agree. And so like in the Roman system, matter, form, and intention does not have as part of that any kind of abjuration of heresy or profession of faith.
right, yeah. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I was wanting to touch on was,
Oh,
I
by the
guess,
way, let me make one caveat there. I do remember there is a place in Denzinger where there's a question about, well, what is the absolute essential thing to profess to be baptized? There actually is a requirement. And again, I'm going from memory, but I'm 90% sure that it may be a question of the Holy Office or something like that, but one of the replies to Denzinger is that you do have to profess belief in the Trinity and the Incarnation before you can be baptized. For an adult, obviously, not for children.
right. Um, yeah, I guess what I'm getting hung up on is uh, with having to renounce like these heresies and stuff. Does it not make it so that the Orthodox view is more so similar to the Protestant view in that it relies on kind of like it's less about like the sacrament itself and more about one's own disposition towards the faith?
No, no, no. Maybe I should be clearer that like one of the reasons that, and that's actually a really good question. One of the reasons that we wouldn't say what you're saying is because we don't have the we don't have the matter, form, and intention scientific definition. For the Orthodox view, what's quote necessary for the sacrament is different. Like, obviously, yeah, we would say there's got to be, you know, the ritual. There's got to be, but like we never made a definition of the essence of a sacrament like the medieval Latin Church did. So, another example where this is evident is in the Eucharist. There was a dispute that came up in the Latin Church as to whether the epiclesis was part of the essence of the Eucharist. And the Roman Church determined no, the essence of the Eucharist in the sense of the form is the words of consecration. So, for example, epiclesis in the Roman system, you could have the Eucharist without the epiclesis. In the Orthodox Church, we don't think that makes any sense because there's no like scientific definition of, oh, this is the essence of what's necessary to have the Eucharist. For us, for example, like it does like Eucharistic adoration doesn't make sense as a practice outside of the celebration of the liturgy. That this never existed in the Orthodox Church, never existed in the first millennium. I'm not saying people don't adore the Eucharist. I'm talking about the practice of Eucharistic adoration
Right.
outside of people receiving the Eucharist doesn't make sense in the Orthodox Church, but it does make sense in the Roman Church because you can kind of have these things piecemeal without the whole context. So you can have the Eucharist with words of consecration and no epiclesis. In the Orthodox Church, it makes no sense to have this essence of the Eucharist without the calling down of the Holy Spirit. We don't see how that would even be possible. So because we don't have a strict matter, form, and intention doctrine of the essence of a sacrament, we actually think that there's quite a few things that like should be there. You got to have an Orthodox priest. You got to have obviously the water. You got to have the words. It needs to be a Trinitarian immersion. Those are the traditional norms that we think ought to be there. However, let's say a priest accidentally said, "We baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit," or uh, you know, let's say on the third dunk he didn't get the person's head all the way under the water. Like, would that suddenly invalidate it? No, I think Orthodox economia, we have the principle that God's grace makes up for whatever is lacking, even in the sacraments.
Yeah. Um. Yeah. Well, I have to clock in at work here in 7 minutes, so I've got to go. But thank you for this conversation.
Hey
It's
man,
been
I absolutely, I really appreciate you and commend you for having a really civil Catholic conversation. So really good. By the way, those are actually really good questions. Eschaton said that he thought that it wasn't a very good argument, and so he's particularly the person that I wanted to speak with in regard to being able to restate what the argument is and why it's such a devastating argument. What's up, man? How you doing?
Good, man. How are you? Can you hear me all right? Or
Yeah, I'm well. We can hear you really good. What's up?
okay, so like was saying in the chat earlier, I think I understand the argument, and I'm honest. I'm not really on one side or the other. I'm kind of centrist in the whole thing. But is the point that's being made by the EO apologists that the Roman Catholics are saying, oh, the papacy provides unity, and look at all these schisms, but in the same time they were still it kind of validates the first millennium church, but at the same time post Vatican II and all this other stuff that we have, is the Sede Vacantis, we have the Palmarian church, even though they're kind of
No,
like
no, no, no.
no.
Let me just make it really quick and simple and precise. The
Yeah.
argument is that the problems that Ibarra or Voice of Reason lists as what are defeaters for orthodoxy. If the Roman Catholic Church is the church of the first millennium, then those same defeaters become defeaters for the Roman Catholic Church of the first millennium. That's the argument. Does that make sense or not?
Yes, it does make sense. Yeah.
Okay, and do you, why I know that you don't necessarily agree with it, but
Yeah.
why do you think that could you explain why it makes sense?
Well, honestly, I mean, I've been kind of researching both. I've been a Roman Catholic my whole life, but I've been researching Orthodoxy for probably like 3 years or so now. And I was like about ready to jump ship for a minute, and I was honestly because listening to your show. But then I read Russia and the Universal Church, and while I do believe that EOs are part of the one church, I believe that the papacy just provides a more normative means of unity. I mean, that's like, I guess it's personal preference, but that's just kind of where I'm at right now. You know what I mean?
Okay, so a couple different issues here. First of all, uh, I've read Solovyev's book, so and I don't mean this in a condescending way. You're pretty much at the exact same point I was at in 2007 and 8, where I was trying to decide between, okay, I've been attending Antiochian liturgy, I've been going to some catechumen classes, I'm a trad cat. I'm just kind of not sure where I'm at between these two. And I read that book because I thought, maybe this would be a good kind of Eastern Catholic midway approach or something. I mean, I know Solovyev's not Eastern Catholic. He was writing about issues that he saw in the church in terms of, and one of the key arguments he makes, for example, is very similar to the argument that Voice of Reason and Ibarra make, which is that, well, you've got these different bishops and patriarchates that remove each other from being in communion.
Yeah.
And if you've got like a Bulgarian church out of communion with another church for about 100 years, then that seems to be a pretty strong defeater for the possibility of the Orthodox Church having unity. But that's another version of this very point that I'm making and that Ubi's making, which is that the problem is that that's very common in the first 1,000 years of Christianity.
Yeah.
And what we don't see is the Roman See actually being a solution to this. That's why it was really important
Ah, okay.
for
Yeah.
Ubi for Ubi to bring up the Meletian Schism, because in the Meletian Schism, if you read the letters of Basil, Basil says Rome actually made the problem worse in terms of the Meletian Schism and offered no help whatsoever. So the very examples that we would point to, I think, are defeaters for the first millennium church being the Roman Catholic Church. And it's a double-edged sword because it also shows this argument that Soloviev and Voice of Reason and Ibarra use would also defeat the first millennium church for being a Roman Catholic institution as well. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
So if I can rehash it back to you, just to make sure I understand. So if the papacy was this figure of unity, then why didn't they do their jobs in the first millennium with all these schisms, et cetera? Right.
That's one point that Basil's letters make. But separate
Got it.
from that, if the argument from Voice of Reason is let's say for the sake of argument that's the case, and political squabbles, jurisdictional squabbles, removal of one bishop from another in terms of communion, if those are defeaters for being the one true church, and if the Roman Catholic Church is the church of the first millennium, it has all of those same problems, and thus it becomes a defeater for the Roman Catholic Church in the first millennium as well.
Okay. Got it. Okay. All
Now,
right.
that's one argument, that's one key point. But separate from that, if you look at what I posted today, this is a whole other topic. You'll notice that Ephesus grants autocephaly to the Church of Cyprus in Canon 8. The Roman Catholic Church doesn't have autocephalous churches. And so that right there is another kill shot proof that the Roman Catholic system post first millennium is not the same church in terms of its ecclesiology and ecclesial structure as the church in the first millennium.
Okay. Got it. All right. Well, to push back a little bit, and it's not because I want to be conversational. It's because
That's fine.
I honestly do want to know what the
No, I
position
welcome it.
is.
You seem like a genuine, like inquiring person. That's fine. I welcome it.
Okay, so one of the examples, and I know this was kind of brought up in the debate a little bit by Voice of Reason. One of the examples in Russia in the Universal Church is that there was an Anglican bishop that was going to become EO, but the church, I believe it was Russia and Greece didn't agree on whether his baptism was valid. That seems like a big deal to me if you can't agree on if someone is even in the church to begin with. You know what I mean? Like I understand there's like nuances to which church you're
Yeah.
in, but that's like a red flag to me personally. You know what I mean?
Okay, so yeah, let's that's a good question. So let's deal with that because I remember too when I was like, I'd say around 2007 or 8, um, I had the assumption that you either have a Protestant position on sacraments or you have the Roman Catholic position of ex opere operato. And if you don't believe in ex opere operato, then you have Donatism. And the mistake that I believed at that time was that that's really the only options. The difference is that Orthodox ecclesiology is not the same thing as the Roman Catholic sacramentology and ecclesiology when it comes to ex opere operato. So we don't believe Donatism, and I'm just saying this to kind of get a couple things out of the way, but then I'll get to your example of the Anglican guy.
Got it.
Uh, we, so we don't believe that uh, you can mechanically maintain the power of sacraments if you're an apostate or if you lose the faith. And the Roman Catholic Church differs from us on this because they actually believe that you could be ordained to the priesthood. That same day, you can become a Satanist, you can leave the church, and you can still, for the rest of your life, confect a real, valid, grace filled Eucharist, for example.
Hmm.
For us, we think that's preposterous. We think it's insane. We also think it's preposterous and insane that, for example, a Muslim or an atheist can baptize people.
Yeah.
But that's the logic of the Roman Catholic adoption of ex opere operato as it develops into early and medieval theology, right? By the time of the 7th century, by the time of the middle, the Roman Catholic Latin Church has basically explicated a very strict view that what's necessary for the sacrament is matter, form, and intention. The weird part is, how can an atheist or a Muslim have the intention to do baptism? It doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever, and yet that is the Roman Catholic official dogmatic position.
Yeah.
So notice that if you go the Roman Catholic route, it's not just avoiding donatism. You're actually adopting an absurdist position that Satanists can confect the Eucharist and that atheists and Muslims can have the intention to do what the church
So
does.
it's not necessarily
Orthodoxy,
like personal
go ahead.
sin, it's more like being outside of the church.
Well, the logic of the ex operato position eventually in the Roman system went further than just the question of the validity in, say, a sect or a schism. It went all the way into saying that an atheist and a Muslim can baptize. That's in
Yeah.
Denzinger. And the Orthodox would say, if you've left the faith, that's no longer a sacrament. It's not valid and there's no grace.
Yeah.
There's a separate question when it comes to sects and groups that do the rituals correctly. And in that case, you might have a schismatic who has all the same theology. Like, say, for the Orthodox perspective, if we saw a Monophysite and the Monophysite, you know, Coptic or whoever, they wanted to come to the Orthodox Church, there's always been flexibility in the ancient canons as to how people can be received. So debate about different people's reception is actually normal and has always happened in the history of the church. Let me give you an example. If you look at the canons of the Sixth Council, it actually states that some sects and heretics, their baptisms are not considered at all able to be received. So, for example, it mentions the Unitarians. If you had a Unitarian modalist baptism, that is not a baptism, even if you use the right words, because the intention and the understanding was Unitarian. And so there's a canon in the Sixth Council that says we do not accept Unitarian baptism. But there's other cases where if a novationist, or if a Donatist, or if any of these groups that happen to also be Trinitarian did a baptism, we could receive their the rite. Although we would say as Orthodox that what's preventing the grace is actually is being in the heresy. So once they abjure the heresy, that can be accepted. So the fact that there was disagreement between Greeks and Russians about the reception of converts or the vesting of priests is again another thing that was pretty common in the ancient church. And if you look at the canons of St. Basil, for example, Basil just kind of says stuff like, well, you know, over there they receive people in this way. We receive people with, you know, abjuration of heresy and chrismation. It's okay. It's okay because we leave it up to the local level.
Mhm.
So I don't actually even think that's a kill shot unless you have the assumption that a lot of Roman Catholics do, which is that the only way to have the church is to have one single way of receiving converts. And so that's just simply foisting Roman Catholic ecclesiology onto Orthodoxy and saying, if you don't have this ecclesiology and way to receive converts in a unified way, then you can't be the true church. But the problem is that that same standard, again, also doesn't work in the Roman Catholic Church. For example, in the Roman Catholic system, there are three patriarchs of Antioch. Well, that's a violation of the ancient canons. And how do we know which one is the actual patriarch of Antioch? In that case, well, the Pope has actually said that all three are okay. Well, there's not supposed to be in the canons of the church three patriarchs of Antioch. There's only supposed to be one. So that is another element or example of quote division.
Mhm.
Likewise, the Roman Catholic Church allows the Eastern churches to not say the filioque, whereas in the Latin Rite, they have to say the Filioque. How is that? That's two different faiths and two different creeds. The ancient church decreed that there's only one creed for the church.
Yeah.
And yet the papacy allows two different creeds to be recited. And even in their Vatican clarification document, they admit that the theology is different between the East and the West. They admit that
Which document
even
was
though
that?
you can find
Sorry.
it's called the Vatican clarification on the
Okay,
Filioque.
got it.
And if you read that whole document, it gets down to the bottom and it basically says on the issue of double eternal hypostatic procession, we still do have a disagreement and a tension. So it still admits that the key issue is not quote resolved.
Got
Does
it.
that make sense? So in other words, you can't just say, well, the Roman See is allowing the uniates to not say the Filioque and the Latin Church has to say it, but we have the same understanding. When the Vatican clarification admits that, it's still not the same understanding.
Got it.
Likewise, for example, the Latin Church does not teach that you can participate in uncreated grace. It believes in created grace, and the Uniates believe in uncreated grace, like us. So there's an illusion of the same theology, the same faith, that which isn't actually on the ground. For example, the Melkite Catechism says there's 7 ecumenical councils. Well, that's not what the Roman Catholic Papal Church teaches, and yet the Melkite Catechism just says what we say is orthodox, right?
Yeah.
So at every juncture, what appears to be a pretty solid sort of papal example of unity isn't actually a papal example of unity. And the last um, couple examples I'll give is in Unum Sanctum, you had to in the 1300s, you had to believe in the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop to be saved, not just his spiritual supremacy, but his temporal supremacy. That doctrine is no longer confessed or mandatory after Vatican II because you have the decatholicization of Christian states and you have the loss of the papacy's temporal power. And yet in the 1300s, this was a doctrine necessary for salvation. So that is another change that shows that it's not the same church of the first millennium as it is the second millennium, and that it even changed and discarded this medieval doctrine that was necessary. Secondly, how has the papacy provided unity and clarity on something so fundamental as the death penalty when it was necessary and part of just natural law and natural justice in the Catechism of Trent? And by the time of Francis and John Paul II, it's quote against the gospel. When it comes to fundamental things like contraception, Roman Catholics claim to have this unified position, and yet they didn't have a statement on it until Humana Vitae and Pius XII statement, whichever document that was. So, well, now wait a minute. If unification on this is an indicator of the true church, then the Roman Church lacked it until they made this statement in Pius XII and in Paul VI Humana Vitae. So that would also be another defeater for the Roman Catholic position, you see. And then furthermore, in 1928, it was still considered an apostasy from the gospel to engage in interfaith gatherings and ecumenism. And
Yeah, that
after
one's a big one for me.
Mortalium
That's probably my
but
biggest red flag,
yeah,
honestly.
yeah, you get a couple decades later at Vatican II, and it's now the work of the Holy Spirit. So to me, these are indicators that although Rome, it's kind of like a car sales pitch, right? It's like I'll give you a good car. It's right here. Look how pretty it is. Look, it's a beautiful car, and yet it's like it doesn't have an engine, doesn't have a carburetor, doesn't actually do anything, but it looks like a pretty car. I mean, it's got all the appearance of a car, but it doesn't have the actual engine and workings of a car. It's not a unified working system. It just has the appearance of it under the banner of the Pope. And yet you've got the Latin Mass that's been suppressed. I mean, I used to go to the SSPX for like 8 years.
Mm,
And we thought that when Benedict was elected, he had all this, pro Latin Mass uh, verbiage that he was spouting. Oh, maybe we're finally going to get a movement towards, some rectification on this and that. But even if there had been a wide scale promotion of Latin Mass, there still would have been all the issues of Vatican II and the documents of Vatican II, right?
yeah.
And there's never going to be you can't retract Vatican II. It's already been like dogmatized. It's already in the catechism. It's already been taught by the Roman See throughout the entire world. So there's no like going back. And we could try to say stuff like, well, maybe we can figure out a way to interpret, Vatican II to make it fit with Vatican I. or the pre-Vatican II teachings. But I think if you read a book like the 10 books, the 16 papal documents book, it's pretty clear that you've got 2 or 3 centuries of papal teaching against ecumenism, against freedom of conscience, freedom of worship, freedom of religion, against a secularized state, um, on and on and on, syllabus of errors, quas primas, morari vos, lamentabili. I mean, all of these documents just hammer away at all the basic principles that Vatican II reverses and makes mandatory. So to me, Vatican II in the last 70 years of the papacy is the great worldwide testament to the fact that the papacy not only does it not provide unity, it actually is a hindrance to it.
Got it. So last kind of thing here is like I don't know if you could tell in my tone. Hopefully you can, but like I just want to go where is the truth, but at the same time it's like, well, the way I see it is like, okay, the Roman Catholics have all these messed up problems. The EO has all these problems, and it's like, well, where do you even go? Like, I guess you just got to go
Well,
with your
that's why I keep
conscience.
no, no,
But
I keep saying like the it's the type of problem. Not
yeah,
every
yeah,
problem is a system level defeater, and that's why if you can show a dogmatic papal contradiction or a contradiction in the magisterium, that's a system level defeater. So for me, when I was, trad cat and, then in 2007, 8, I started reading the exact same stuff you're talking about. I read Solovyev's book. I read, started reading the Eastern Fathers. I read all the sort of normal stuff that people first encountered, Timothy Ware. I read, Peter Gilchrist. I read all these different positions. Then I went back and I read like, some of the, what's that guy's name? The Butler, Dahlgren, and Hess book on the papacy. So I was at exactly the point that you were at right now, back at that time, and I remember getting really frustrated, and I remember thinking like this papal thing kind of goes back and forth. It's really difficult to reconcile it with all these different quote mines, and then I have to go
yeah,
actually read all the context of the quote mines, and I finally decided that the only way that I would actually be able to settle this issue would be, first of all, the theology, not just, I mean, I understand that the papacy is part of the theology, but like theology proper in terms of like the Trinity and Christology. And on top of that, I decided that if there's a system level defeater, then that would defeat the system.
yeah,
And even Navarro said in our debate at the beginning of it at some point, he said something like, Jay, if you could show a papal contradiction in the magisterium, then yes, it would be a defeater for Catholicism. So I've always seen like these key, dogmatic contradictions as the defeaters. And I don't see those as defeaters, those same defeaters in the Orthodox system. So I think you have to judge these systems on their own paradigm and their own standards. Like you can't take a papal idea of what unity is and say, oh, look, Orthodoxy doesn't have the papal idea of
yeah,
unity,
yeah, yeah,
therefore Orthodoxy, because we have a different conception of what the unity of the churches is. It's just like Ubi was arguing. It's the mindset of the authors of the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. It's the Cappadocians' idea, right? That's what they were writing when they wrote that creed. We can't read back into it what Vatican I thinks that the idea of unity is, and then say, "Look, you didn't meet the standards of Vatican I's idea of unity." I mean, I don't mean to change the subject, but like you've seen the Chieti and Alexandria documents, right?
yeah. I have, and that's kind of what made me kind of throw my hands up and be like, well, I mean, I guess we can't really tell them that they're not part of the church because we say they're part of the church, So it's
Well, that right there would be an obvious
yeah,
like
yeah,
flip flop on the part of the papacy. Like, why is the papacy just not saying what it said at Vatican I? Because Vatican I says in the anathemas, if you don't accept Vatican I's teaching, you're anathema.
yeah, yeah, and obviously that
Or
would
think
apply to
of it this
yeah,
way, like, why does the Roman Catholic Church no longer do anathemas when it used to?
yeah, yeah. That makes sense. Um,
But hey, man, I mean, those are great questions, and I really appreciate you actually coming and having the dialogue. I mean, feel free to bring up whatever topics you want otherwise too.
Yeah, yeah, I'd like to just like kind of think on this a little bit. And my main focus, like, yeah, I understand like the ecclesiology is the foundation of everything, but myself, like you, I'm more interested in theology. So I kind of would
Well,
like
I,
to
I
just.
actually, I actually think the theology is more important than ecclesiology. I believe that
Okay, gotcha.
ecclesiology actually stems from first, like in the Orthodox order of theology, the Ordo Theologia, it's Trinity. Christology, and then sacramentology and ecclesiology flow from those two.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by the way, isn't it interesting that if the Vatican I idea of the church is the ideal indicator of the church, why did it take them 2,000 years to figure that out and define that? Wouldn't that have been one of the first things defined?
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, at the same time, you know, faith is like a mustard seed. I mean, we don't get the whole thing all at once.
No,
I mean,
I
that's
disagree with that. That's the Newman model, and the Orthodox idea is the opposite. We would argue that every one of the fundamental essential components is in the apostolic deposit. There's nothing that was necessary that came about in the 7th century or the 5th century. Now you might say, well, but what about icons or what about, words like inhypostatized at the 5th council? We would just simply say that those terms are explicating and specifying ideas that were already there. That's why it's very important for us, for example, to say that the Trinity is not a New Testament doctrine.
yeah.
It's
Yeah, I agree with you
it's
guys. The
the
stuff that you go
yeah.
with, like with Aiken and Horn and everything, it's like you guys are completely wrong on this. But
Well, the same principle applies, I think, in terms of the apostolic deposit too. Like the notion of some communion rail or some form of iconostasis was even there at the very beginning. It comes out of the Jewish temple and synagogue system. It's not something that was developed by the time of the Seventh Council. And this, I think, is a very bad argument that Ibarra makes because he gives the Protestants all this leverage, especially Gavin Ortland, when Ibarra says stuff like, "Oh, well, icons developed by the time of the Seventh Council. They weren't there in the early church." That's a Protestant argument.
yeah,
If you read the, and by the way, it's a denial of the Seventh Council because the very first statements in the Seventh Ecumenical Council actually say we in line with the tradition of the fathers, uphold the apostolic tradition of iconography. So the Seventh Council actually argues that it's not a development, but that it was actually an apostolic tradition. And it's the same principle as relics and the Eucharist and the cross, which go back to the early centuries of the church, right? The principle is that it's an incarnational faith and that they were always there. Now, it's not the case that the Catacomb Church is necessarily going to have a giant ornate basilica because they're being persecuted, obviously, but the principles are still there. In fact, when I went to Rome, you can walk through the catacombs and you could see that the Christians drew imagery on the walls and over the altar and on the altar
yeah, yeah. I see what you're saying.
in the catacombs, which are like first, second, third century.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, cool. I'd like to call back in another time and kind of chop up the essence energies distinction too. I don't have time to go there,
Absolutely, yeah.
so
That's
I'd love to
that's
talk.
actually my favorite topic. In fact, is that's the gender distinction. I think that was the uh, ultimate like thing that tipped me over towards orthodoxy.
Yeah, honestly, I just got finished with Palamas's triads, and it's pretty good.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty
Hey,
good.
that's
So
that's great. You read that, yeah.
yeah. So all right, man. Cool. I appreciate your time. I look forward to talking again.
Absolutely, anytime, man. Anytime.
Actually, he kind of addressed the question a little bit, but I kind of want to get your quick expanded view, if possible,
Sure, go ahead.
on uh, um, so in that debate, UB mentioned that dogma is through consensus. How would you define consensus, or how does the East, I should say, define consensus changed over time at all?
Right. So that's actually a fair question, and Ubi is correct to go to just the basic patristic idea out of Saint Vincent Lorenz in the Commonatory that what has been believed by everywhere at all times. Right. That's what constitutes Catholicity. It's fine to say that. Of course, you do have to get a little more precise because yes, there are periods when not everybody believes it. Right. So like the majority. Can you mute? It's really loud background noise.
Sorry.
There are cases where the majority are in error, like in the 4th century with the Arian crisis. Athanasius says that they have the buildings, we have the faith. At one point, I think it was just Athanasius and a handful of bishops that weren't semi-Arian. So it can't be just a numbers game. But what Ubi means by reception is also not just at one point in time, because you might have at one point in time error being the majority belief. So no, he doesn't mean like just some sort of low tier democracy of like, well, 51% believe that Arianism is true, so it's true. what he means is that by reception, that can even happen over time. Like it might even take 100 years for some issue or some topic to be received throughout the whole Orthodox world. So, for example, the Palamite synods were local Byzantine synods that confirm, the Roman Catholic, the Orthodox position on energies and against filioque over against the Roman Catholic position. And eventually, those synods are received by all the Orthodox world, but even though it wasn't instantaneous. But that same principle of reception operates, ironically, in the Roman Catholic system too. Roman Catholics believe that a true pope is the one that the Roman Curia has elected, quote, validly, and has been received by the entire Catholic world. Likewise, ecumenical councils in the Orthodox Church, like the second one, were had out of communion with Rome. St. Meletius died out of communion with Rome. It confirms the Orthodox correct doctrine of the Trinity that Rome accepts several centuries later. So even the Roman Catholic position admits that true councils, true dogma can happen and be received centuries later by Rome, you see. So that's another type of reception theory that even takes time that Rome would have to concede, and that would be to our side.
Okay, that makes sense. I appreciate you defining it. That's all I had.
No, those are great questions. Yeah, you do have to specify, like Mr. Lorenz says, believed everybody by all at all times. Like it does require a little more, a little more charitable nuance.